Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Molweni. Ninjani. I was just testing, if there are some people who can participate into our Xhosa course. We offer a very, very special Xhosa courses that within a short time you will find yourself clicking. So next time, please enroll for the Xhosa also. So my name is it's Mbulungeni Madiba. I'm the Deputy Dean in the Center for Higher Education. I work with Ms. Medirol. So I'm just here to welcome you. Well, I know you've already been welcomed to our beautiful city of Cape Town, but more especially, I would want to welcome you to this lecture and also to introduce you to our speaker, who is Chris Danziger. I was just chatting with him here, then I realized that if I were to use our language, we would just call him a veteran. He belonged to that club. He has been here as a student, and he has also taught here at UCT. And besides teaching here, he has also, I think, done many lectures here at UCT. And they're just telling me that started far back in the 1970s. So we are quite pleased to be with you here. And he, for the last 15 years, he has been a tutor in the continuing education department of the University of Oxford. His special interests are the history of Napoleonic France and Romanov Russia, and has published extensively in this area. He has, as I said, he has previously given wonderful lectures, and I've got no doubt that this one will be the same. So without much ado, I don't want to waste your time. I will hand it over to him, and over to you, Mr. Chris Danziger. All the best.
Am I audible? Good. Can I just say one thing before we start? Russian history is full of really brutal secret police. As we'll see, Ivan the Great had the Oprichniki, Peter the Great had the Streltsy, Catherine the Great had the Okhrana, Stalin had the KGB, Putin's got the FSB. But all these people's punishments are mild compared to the hit squad here to deal with people whose phones ring during the lecture. So anyone who might be tempted, this is your chance to turn them off. Right. The series of lectures, Tsars and Commissars, I think the subtitling got altered slightly in transmission, and the subtitle that I was designed was The Rulers Who Made Russia Great. And that is really the theme that I am going to pursue this week. And, your first reaction to that question might be, why shouldn't Russia be great? The largest country in the world, covering 1/6 of the world's land surface, blessed with vast mineral assets, including the 8th largest oil deposits in the world, a large homogeneous population, the 9th largest in the world, bordered by sea coasts on 3 sides. What's to prevent it from becoming great? Well, of course, that's how it is today, but it wasn't always like that, and it was certainly not inevitable that that was how it would turn out. And this is a physical map of the area of the Russian state today, and the crucial thing about it is that here is a huge landmass with very few natural borders. And states with few natural borders have always struggled to remain in existence. Conversely, countries with obvious natural borders even if they have very small populations, like Switzerland or Japan or Lesotho, they have managed to retain the integrity of their borders in the face of continuous international pressure. But what the Russians had to do, they actually had to expand over enormous distances until eventually they reached the natural borders of the Himalayas, the Pacific, and the Arctic. And that's really what this map is showing you, that those are really the only significant natural borders on this whole space, the Himalayas, the Pacific, and the Arctic. But of course, a landscape with few natural borders offers opportunities as well as dangers. It offers opportunities, of course, to other people ambitious to encroach on this area. And the history of Russia is a story of both opportunities and dangers. And you can see the Ural Mountains there. And I always used to think, that the Ural Mountains must be a colossal, imposing range, a bit like that marvelous scene after 10 minutes of the Dr. Zhivago. But actually, when you get there, as the guidebook says, they're rather insignificant. In fact, honestly, you'd hardly know where they were, even if you're standing in the middle of them. I mean, this is a natural border with very few deterrents at all. And historically, the people who settled the western sector of this area were Slavs. So you might think, well, if they're a single ethnic group, you might expect them to become dominant. And this is a map, as it were, of the Slav people of Europe. But of course, as the map shows you, the Slavs splintered into literally hundreds of subgroups. And if you look at this map, you'll see that west of Russia, the Slavs fragmented into over a dozen different nationalities. And over time, the differences between these nationalities became more pronounced, but even today, a Czech can understand, more or less, a Ukrainian, and a Russian can understand a Serbian. And this map, I don't know whether you can see it well enough, but it gives you the word for bear in various European languages. And you can see that the word for bear in what we call today Russia is medved. In Polish, wouldn't know how to pronounce that, but it comes to the same thing. In Bulgarian, it's medve, and so on, like that. In other words, all these languages are very common to each other. So, why did the Eastern Slavs not fragment into smaller localized groups in the same way as the Western Slavs? Do you understand the problem that we're posing? And as I said, the absence of natural borders offers both dangers and opportunities. And the Eastern Slavs were overrun countless times. That's the people in what we now call Russia. In the 8th and the 9th centuries, they were overrun by Vikings from Scandinavia, and they established political control over the Slavs. And these Vikings were referred to as Rus, and the lands which they ruled, therefore, became known as Russia. And the Rus, in turn, fragmented into many smaller states, each with a ruler who claimed descent from the original ruling family, that was the house of Rurik, or Roderick, as he would have been further west. And that was why, until the 20th century, the Tsars always referred to themselves as the Tsars of all the Russias, because they were laying claim to the legacy of all these different splinter groups. But that's looking ahead a long way. In the 13th century, the fragmentation of the Rus, in other words, this original nucleus had splintered into many subgroups, and they fragmented, and this made them easy prey for the next invaders, who were the Mongols under Genghis Khan. And here is a sort of impression of the explosion of Genghis Khan's empire from its nucleus in what we would now call Mongolia, and the speed at which they go across from Mongolia almost as far as the Baltic, absolutely dizzying, as you can see. In 1211, they're in their capital. By 1223, they've almost reached Kiev. And the Mongols proved to be the most successful empire builders of all time. And their military superiority, of course, was based on a 12th century wonder weapon, and that was known as the horse. And what distinguished the Mongol horsemen was that they could fire arrows from horseback. And they subjected almost all of what we could today call Russia into a condition of vassalage. And in most cases, that meant paying enormous sums in tribute, actually to avoid being laid waste by the famous Mongol armies. And that was really as far as they went in their domination of the subject people. All they want really is tribute from them. But after the death of Genghis Khan's sons, their empire fragments too. So in other words, I'm just trying to make the point that all the previous occupants of this space, have splintered into smaller groups, but the achievement of the state we today call Russia is that it has not splintered. And here is the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into different khanates, as they're called, and behind them they leave a legacy of Asiatic culture and Asiatic genes, which are a key ingredient in the Russian makeup today. But, as I say, the point I'm trying to stress is that even the Mongols couldn't create a lasting political unit out of the huge areas they'd conquered so swiftly. So, don't underestimate the achievement of the Russian rulers in creating the superpower that Russia eventually became. It was far from an inevitable outcome, and it starts with a period of Mongol domination over the smaller states into which the Rus had fragmented. Now, some of those states that the Rus or that the Mongols had established domination over, some of them resisted the Mongol invasions and they were extinguished in the process. But others cooperated with the invaders and ensured their survival by doing so. And in general, the further west these states lay, the easier it was to do so. And one of the states which benefited most from cooperation with the Mongols was the Duchy of Muscovy. And the origins of Muscovy are pretty humble. The first known ruler of Muscovy was a duke called Daniel, and here is the hill fort of Muscovy in the time of Daniel. We're talking about the beginning of the 14th century. And as you can see, this is a humble place at this time. And they agreed, the dukes of Muscovy agreed, to collect taxes and tribute from other Russian states on the Mongols' behalf. And Muscovy and the Mongols acted jointly against other Russian states when they rebelled against Mongol overlordship. So in other words, they became sort of lapdogs of the Mongols, and this was really how the state of Muscovy, became a dominant state. And throughout the 14th century, the Duchy of Muscovy continued to expand at the expense of its neighbours. In 1325, very important development, the Russian Orthodox Church thought that its security or its prospects of security were stronger if it allied itself with Muscovy, so they moved its headquarters to Moscow from where it had previously been in Kiev. And then the Muscovites have help from another unexpected source, and that is that an even more ferocious conqueror from the east, Timur, or Tamburlaine, as he's often known in English, he destabilized the Mongols and set up a superior authority. So, by the mid-15th century, and incidentally, I've got a chronology which is, I suspect, won't appear in time for the end of this lecture, but it will come tomorrow. By the mid-15th century, under Ivan III, Ivan, of course, is just Russian for John, Muscovy felt strong enough to throw off the Mongol yoke, and rival rulers now voluntarily subordinate themselves to Muscovy. And Ivan III's 43-year-long reign is often credited with laying the foundations of the modern Russian state. And I could, in fact, have made him the subject of today's talk, except it wouldn't have sounded nearly as interesting. And whereas other Russian principalities evolved quite democratically, under Ivan III, Muscovy became a hard-line autocracy, with even the Muscovite aristocracy, who are normally known as boyars, reduced to servile dependency on the prince. And other Russian principalities had practiced religious toleration, but Ivan was a bigoted anti-Catholic. And it's often said that through this attitude, he brought down a curtain between the West and Russia, depriving it of the explosion of Western learning and civilization, which we call the Renaissance. Ivan took as his second wife Sophia, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, and claimed that by this marriage he had inherited the leadership of the Christian world. And the Muscovites now referred to Muscovy as the Third Rome. And Ivan III was the first who called himself the ruler of all the Rus. And there is correspondence surviving where he styles himself as Caesar or Tsar. And here, of course, is a fascinating map. You can see right at the center is a sort of dark green section, which is the Duchy of Muscovy. And then it expands into the sort of slightly paler green sections going up to Vologda. And then eventually it takes over the states around it to the north. And that is really the nucleus, of the current state of Russia. So it all started from that tiny little state in the center of Russia. Nothing inevitable about it. It was just a sort of organic historical development. Now, Ivan III bequeathed his throne to his eldest surviving son, Vasily, that's the same as Basil, Vasily III. And Vasily reigned for 31 years, but his reign was less eventful than his father's, or his son, so the Russians have called him Vasily the Adequate. As you can see, Russia's a tough place to do business. And Vasily divorced his first wife because, after 20 years, she had not borne him any children, and at the age of 47, he took as his second wife a Serbian princess, and 3 years later, she produced the much-wanted heir. And her husband was so excited that he built a new church to celebrate this event. And this is a typical church in the new Russian style, in other words, a tented roof. This became a kind of model for Russian churches after this. However, Vasily died in a hunting accident soon afterwards, and his 3-year-old son Ivan officially became the ruler of Muscovy. And first his mother, and then a group of squabbling boyars became regents. And Ivan endured a desperately neglected childhood as a pawn in the struggles to control the crown. It gave him a mistrust and a hatred for the boyar class, which lasted the rest of his life. Finally, in 1547, at the age of 16, he was crowned significantly, not as Grand Prince, but as Tsar of all the Russias. And in a way, it was a signal that Muscovy had entered the modern era. And by being crowned as Tsar, which of course is just the same word as Kaiser, Caesar, Shah, they're all the same word, he had taken on the title of the Byzantine and Mongol emperors who had divine approval, and had legitimized the autocratic powers of the Muscovite rulers both at home and abroad, and symbolically they put on their heads when they are crowned, and this goes right up to Nicholas II, the so-called cap of Monomaque, and that was supposed to confirm your imperial status. And it's interesting that this is the cap which the Russian Tsars put on to symbolize their kind of graduation to Western-style imperialism, but this is a very Asiatic, piece of costume. Most people think that the origins of this cap are possibly from the Mongols or even the Crimean Tatars. Anyway, altogether, Ivan ruled for 51 years, 13 as a minor and 38 in his own right. And his reign could hardly have got off to a worse start. 3 months after his coronation, a calamitous fire swept through the largely wooden city of Moscow. It's said that 80,000 people were displaced and about 3,000 killed, although I never trust any of these figures, but let's say an awful lot of people were displaced and killed. And the Muscovites blamed Ivan's mother's family. Do you remember the Serbian family, the Glinskis? And they stoned the head of the family to death in the Cathedral of the Dormition. And the result was a strengthening of the Tsar's position. And that set a pattern which would be repeated many times during his reign. And incidentally, fires in Moscow happen on an average once every 15 years. They don't always destroy as much as this fire, but Moscow, of course, has been prone to fires throughout its history. Now, the first decade of Ivan's rule started quietly, with peaceful reforms and modernization, more like Ivan the Sensible. And one of his earliest measures was the creation of a council of nobles called the Chosen Council, and we don't know how many of the reforms were the work of the 16-year-old Tsar and how many were the work of the council. We just have to use our common sense. But the laws were codified, a Russian parliament was introduced, a standing army was created, a synod which regulated church affairs, and self-government was granted to local, mostly rural communities. It was actually quite similar to the work being carried out by monarchs elsewhere in Europe, like Henry VIII in England or the Emperor Charles V in Spain and Germany. And what was happening was that the foundations of a modern state were being laid. In 1552, when Ivan was 22 years old, the time was adjudged right for an attack on the Khanate of Kazan. And can you see where Moscow is? And Kazan is immediately to the east and to the south of Moscow. Everyone see? And this was the last great survival of the Mongol Empire in Western Russia, if you like. And the Khanate was the largest state still surviving from that era. And it existed in a semi-permanent state of war with Muscovy, and as late as 1521 had captured and ransacked Moscow. And Moscow was altogether captured by enemy troops something like 11 times during this period. So it's a very fragile existence that we're talking about. And the economy of the Khanate of Kazan was more or less dependent upon trading and raiding in slaves, mostly Russian slaves, of course. And the Russians built a wooden fort, and they floated it 700 kilometers down the Volga to Kazan, and when it was within striking distance, Ivan marched at the head of his army to Kazan. They besieged the capital, and by now the technological balance had turned in favor of the West. The Russian artillery and military engineers were decisive in forcing Kazan to surrender. 4 years later, Kazan's long-term ally, Astrakhan, which you can see just to the south of Kazan. They submitted to Muscovite authority, and the Muscovite state had made the biggest leap of its life. It now controlled the whole Volga basin as far as the Caspian Sea. And the Muscovites reward Ivan by giving him the title Grozny, which actually means awe-inspiring, or formidable, or even fearsome. But it has usually been translated as terrible. And from now on and forever after, he would be Ivan the Terrible, a title which is usually misunderstood. And the annexation of Kazan was not just another staging post on the road to Muscovite expansion. It changed the whole character of Russia into a multinational and multi-faith state. And 2 centuries later, Orthodox Christians were actually a minority in the Russian Empire. And when Catherine the Great visited Kazan in 1767, she wrote to her chief minister, "At last I am truly in Asia." And she sanctioned the rebuilding of the first mosque in Kazan. Here it is, the Marjani Mosque, and many others followed. And today, if you go to Kazan, you can enjoy the extraordinary experience of seeing in one photo frame, so to speak, a Russian Orthodox cathedral and a Sunni Muslim mosque. And another foreign venture, have I got a photograph of that? No. And another foreign venture which proved successful was the advance into Siberia. And the annexation of Kazan brought them into contact with the semi-tribal states to the east, who acknowledged the sovereignty of somebody called the Khan of Siberia. And in 1558, Ivan subcontracted the colonization of Siberia to the powerful Stroganov family. And most people know of the Stroganovs because one of their chefs invented a dish with thinly sliced beef, mushrooms and cream. But the Stroganovs in turn, in 1580, they commissioned a Cossack leader named Yermak to penetrate its lands across the Urals. And by 1639, in other words, less than 60 years later, the Russians had reached the Pacific coast. They'd covered about 7,500 kilometers, the same distance as Cape Town to Khartoum. And yeah, I mean, obviously, this is the Mercator projection, which slightly exaggerates the sort of space in the northern hemisphere, but it's still an extraordinary achievement. And there are 2 reasons for the astonishing speed of this advance, of course, and you know what they are. One is that the area is very sparsely populated. At that time, it probably had no more than 500,000 people. Today, that area only has about 18 million people, although it occupies something like 1/7 of the world's surface. As so often, European diseases, particularly smallpox, proved to be much more deadly than European weapons. And a century after the Russian advance, there were only 300,000 Siberians left, so they'd reduced the population by nearly half. And the other reason was that the Russians could always exploit quarrels between local tribal leaders to their own advantage. And the story is very similar to the story of the Spanish conquest of Peru, or the American advance across the plains, or many similar incursions in Africa. And just to give you an idea of the sort of size, if you transposed Russia and took out the Mercator projection factor, if you took out the size of Russia and put it on the map of Africa, that's approximately the space that it would cover. But to return to our point, by the time of his death in 1584, Ivan could also refer to himself as the Tsar of Siberia, which was a title used by all his successors until the assassination of Nicholas II. And the Russians have never forgotten Ivan's role in expanding the Russian state. although his subsequent foreign policy was by and large a failure. And his success in Kazan encouraged him to turn his attention to the other weak point in Russia's armour, and that was the lack of a usable sea coast. The only sea coast they have is the one on the Arctic. And the obvious place to find one was in Livonia. And do you all see where this is? This is the Baltic coast. These are the states we today call Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Do you understand more or less where we are? And that's what Ivan has his eyes on. And the good thing about Livonia was it didn't really belong to anybody. It was run by a loose confederation of Teutonic knights, powerful bishoprics, and city-states. However, as soon as Ivan's intentions became clear, it seemed that Livonia belonged to everybody. And the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Swedes, the Danes, and even the Hungarians immediately come to its aid. And the war drags on for 24 years. And Ivan made some initial gains, which he eventually had to hand back. It nearly ruined Russia's economy, and it caused repercussions which almost brought down Ivan's government. It all makes him sound rather less than awe-inspiring or fearsome, or even terrible. You might well be wondering why in 2008, in a huge national poll, he was voted the 10th greatest Russian in history. Well, Ivan's lonely and unhappy childhood had the effect of turning him into a great reader and student of the arts. And in 1553, he ordered the establishment of the first printing press in Russia. And it's fascinating to think that until 1556, when this printing press, which became known as the Moscow Print Yard, produced its first book, that there had been no book printed in Russia. It only printed its first book in the Russian language in 1649, which was a treatise on church ritual. Literary Russian only really made its appearance with Pushkin at the beginning of the 19th century. A century later, they've got Pushkin, Tolstoy, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, Gogol, Chekhov, Bulgakov, Nabokov, and a dozen more. I mean, the explosion of Russian literature is absolutely astonishing. And the print yard produced its first Russian newspaper in 1703. You know, even there was a newspaper in the Cape at that stage. And one forgets how very young and how very new most aspects of Russian life are. In 1555, Ivan fulfilled a promise to build a new church in Moscow if God granted him victory against Kazan and Astrakhan. And the result was the Cathedral of the Intercession of the Most Holy Theotokos on the Moat, and this is it. Obviously, it's not known, it's now known as St. Basil's, one of the most extraordinary buildings ever erected, usually known, of course, as St. Basil's. And interestingly, Ivan deliberately cited it in the Posad, which was the space for commoners and commerce, which is sort of outside the Kremlin in each Russian state. In other words, this is not a sort of a church for the elite and for the aristocracy. This is a church for the people. And interestingly, it was originally built of brick and whitewashed walls, and the domes were covered in tin and gilded. And it was only at the end of the 18th century that the present fantastic ceramic colours were introduced. Here you can see sort of in an evolutionary state, but it also gives a very good feeling for the fact that it's in the common space, this cathedral. It's not a kind of preserve of the aristocracy. And had it not been for this extraordinary decision to paint it in ceramic colours like this, it would have looked like any other boring Russian church, like this one. This is the Cathedral of the Annunciation in the Moscow Kremlin, and that was probably built by the same architect who built St. Basil's. And for centuries, it was always reported that Ivan had had the architect of St. Basil's blinded so that he could never again design anything so beautiful. And that's more fake news, I'm afraid. And that architect went on to design many other buildings for Ivan, including at least one 4 years after Ivan's death. Ivan was probably the first Russian ruler who became well known in Western Europe. He established close relations with the Kingdom of England, mostly to combat the influence of his Baltic enemies, the Swedes, the Danes, and the Lithuanians. And in 1551, a group of London merchants set up the Muscovy Company, and Ivan granted the monopoly on Anglo-Russian trade, which lasted for 140 years. And he carried on a correspondence with Queen Elizabeth for 25 years, writing an average of 2 letters a year. At one point, in the thick of a quarrel with the boyars, he asks her if she will grant him asylum in England if necessary. She replies she's willing to do so, but only on the understanding that he will have the funds to maintain himself. On another occasion, when her answer disappoints him, he says, "We had thought you had been ruler over your lands, but now we perceive there be other men that do rule for their own profits, and you flow in your maidenly estate like a maid." But Elizabeth did not seem to take offence. She replied with a conciliatory message. But enough of domestic reforms, successful and unsuccessful foreign wars, artistic patronage, and diplomatic activity. Let's go down to finding how much he deserves the title Ivan the Terrible. Now, our real problem in answering this question, of course, is to work out which of the stories associated with him are fact and which are legend. Well, let's start with his family life. Now, he's usually recorded as having 8 wives, not at the same time, consecutively. And he was devastated when the first one died. And she was actually a Romanov, and that was really the start of the Romanov link to the Tsardom. And he was devastated when she died, and her death has sometimes been blamed for the mental instability and erratic violence which characterized the rest of his reign. He was convinced that she'd been poisoned by the boyars. A number of them were tortured and executed. And it may be said that there was no evidence to support this, but in the 20th century, forensic analysis of her remains did find unnaturally high levels of mercury in her skeleton. That's not conclusive, but it's suggestive. A year later, he married again to a Muslim princess from the Caucasus. Apparently, Ivan was totally smitten by this beautiful 17-year-old. However, she was illiterate and quarrelsome, and the Muscovites hated her. And when she died 8 years later, it was rumoured that Ivan himself had poisoned her. That didn't stop him from torturing and executing a few more boyars on suspicion of murder. 2 years later, he selected the daughter of a Novgorod merchant. She started ailing even before they were married and died a few days after the wedding. A few more boyars were executed on suspicion of her murder. Ivan had difficulty in securing his 4th marriage to Anna, daughter of a courtier, because the Russian Orthodox Church, you may or may not know, prohibits 4th marriages. And the quote is, from the ruling, the 1st marriage is law, the 2nd an extraordinary concession, the 3rd is a violation of law, the 4th is an impiety, a state similar to that of animals. Ivan countered this by claiming he had not consummated his 3rd marriage. However, when Anna failed to produce any offspring, he became disillusioned with her and packed her off to a nunnery and, as it were, abandoned his attempt to keep on the right side of the church. And his 5th wife, another Anna, lasted less than a year before she too was dispatched to a nunnery. And Ivan may or may not have married his next wife, or she perhaps was just a concubine, and she was discovered in flagrante with a courtier, which sounds an unwise thing to do, and after being forced to watch him being impaled on a stake, she was also sent off to a nunnery. And in the 19th century, Russian painters became fixated by the sort of legend of Ivan. And here's a painting by Sedov in 1875 of Ivan admiring his sixth wife, but it could be any of them for all we know. His seventh wife is now thought to have been a 19th century invention. If she existed at all, she was allegedly drowned after having been proved on her wedding night not to have been a virgin. But this does sound like the sort of legends that attach to people that are called Ivan the Terrible. His eighth wife was a boyar's daughter. He allegedly soon fell out of love with her, but she survived by producing a son. So Ivan's 8 wives, or perhaps only 7, have been a major contributor to the legend of the deranged tyrant. The fact that 4 of them died in mysterious circumstances only adds to the legend. However, there is only the faintest possibility that he might have been involved with one of those deaths. And before we get too sanctimonious about Russian barbarism, of course, don't forget that Ivan was an exact contemporary of Henry VIII of England, who definitely had 6 wives and definitely beheaded at least 2 of them. However, things got worse. By his first wife, he had 2 sons who survived to adulthood. The Tsar sent the first 2 wives of his eldest son, Ivan, to nunneries because they failed to breed quickly enough. The third wife, in other words, the third wife of his son, when pregnant, which should have endeared her to him, he beat so violently for wearing immodest clothing that she miscarried. And when his son, also named Ivan, learned of it, he had a furious confrontation with his father, and Ivan struck his son with a scepter, and he fell bleeding to the floor. And Ivan immediately convulsed with remorse, but it was too late. The son died 4 days later. And history painters in later centuries were obsessed with this event. Here is Ivan meditating at his son's deathbed. Look at the portrait of Ivan. Here is Ivan killing his son by a very famous and wonderful painter called Ilya Repin. And here is Ivan again at his deathbed. I mean, this was a scene which made a deep impression upon 19th century Russians. And it's interesting to see how they portray the 51-year-old Tsar. And there's no doubt where they stand on Ivan the Terrible controversy. And actually, little or nothing is known about Ivan's appearance, as virtually all existing portraits were made after his death and contain mostly artists' impressions. In 1567, an ambassador described Ivan as follows: "He's tall, stout, and full of energy." When people used the word stout in those days, they just meant sort of robust, well-built, not necessarily fat. His eyes are big, observing, and restless. His beard is reddish-black, long and thick, but most other hairs on his head are shaved off, according to the Russian habits of the time. So we don't have any known portraits of Ivan or of any Russian Tsar until Peter the Great. And we'll show you more of that tomorrow. In 1963, the graves of Ivan and his sons were excavated and examined by Soviet scientists. And chemical and structural analysis of his remains disproved earlier suggestions that he suffered from syphilis or that he was poisoned by arsenic or strangled. At the time of his death, he was 178 centimeters tall and he weighed 85 to 90 kilograms. His body had a large amount of growths, uncharacteristic of his age. It also contained excessive concentration of mercury, but that was very often used as a cure for a numerous portmanteau of diseases. And researchers concluded that while he had been built athletically in his youth, in his last years he had developed various bone diseases and could barely move. Another of the charges made against Ivan is the infamous oprichniki. Oprichniki literally means separate people, and they were formed in 1564 when Ivan's Livonian War was at its lowest ebb, and there was such public criticism that Ivan staged a fake abdication, retiring to a town 75 miles from Moscow. Here it is, Alexandrovskaya Sloboda. And this is a typical, actually quite a nice example of a Kremlin. And of course, we sometimes talk of the Kremlin as if there were only one, you know, and that's the one in Moscow. But almost every old Russian town has a Kremlin of its own. And Ivan retires to this place in a sort of, as I say, a kind of fake abdication. And the boyars now find that Moscow is ungovernable without him, and they send a delegation to beg him to come back. And he agrees, but only on condition that he has absolute powers to deal with his enemies as he thought fit, which included, of course, executing them or confiscating their estates. And the enforcers who would put this into practice were the oprichniki. And they were a kind of private army answerable only to the Tsar, a bit like Hitler's SS. And enormous numbers of executions and tortures used to be attributable to them. Now it's thought that instead of 60,000 victims, there might have been perhaps 3,000. Well, that's still enough, of course. And most of their victims belonged either to the great boyar families or to cities like Suzdal or Novgorod, which had rebelled against Ivan. And this is what people imagine the oprichniki might have looked like. They had a black monk-style uniform, and they rode black horses, and they carried the insignia of a severed dog's head to sniff out treason, that was the symbolic thing, and a broomstick to sweep them away. And it was said that they executed their enemies by tying each limb to a different horse and riding in opposite directions, or boiling them alive, or impaling them, or roasting them over an open fire. Well, if you're going to do that sort of thing, you will get a bad reputation, even possibly a terrible one. However, Ivan disbanded the whole organization in 1571. So, although for many people the oprichniki are the defining fact of Ivan's reign, they actually had a life of only 7 years. And Ivan's complex personality has divided historians and even the public for centuries. Like many devout and pious religionists, he justified some barbaric cruelty by what he saw as his duty as God's representative on earth to mete out heaven or hell. And one might have imagined that his notorious outbursts and his autocratic whims would have discredited the monarchy. But Russia being the mysterious place that it is, it seems to have consolidated the Tsar's position as someone not accountable to any earthly authority, but only to God. And as a result, the cult of Ivan the Terrible has waxed and waned. If you accept that Russia can only be governed by some highly centralized autocracy, then there's good reason to believe that Ivan was crucial to making Russia great. And the more rulers are prepared to state that autocracy, and this is a very current issue, the more the rulers are prepared to state that their autocracy is essential to Russia's greatness, the better they think of Ivan. The last Romanov empress urged her very un-Ivan-like husband to be Ivan the Terrible, crush them all under you. Some people might think thereby offering him one of the worst role models in Russian history. But guess who promoted the cult of Ivan as a strong ruler who expanded and reinforced the state? Stalin. He commissioned the famous director Eisenstein to make a film of Ivan the Terrible. And Stalin loved part one of the film, which showed the young Ivan overcoming external and internal enemies. And the film was awarded the USSR's highest honor, the Stalin Prize. And here's a little clip of it, I hope. Do you know Eisenstein's films, The Battleship Potemkin? You know, they're wonderful sort of over-the-top extravaganza. What's happening? Don't go.
Венец царя всея Руси на себя возлагает. И тем навеки многовластию злокозненному боярскому на Руси предел кладет. Отныне русской земле единой быть. Но дабы русскую землю в единой длани держать,